I've always loved hiking. There's something about the solitude of the woods, the way the trees seem to wrap you in their stillness. It's like stepping into another world where time slows down, and all that matters is putting one foot in front of the other. That's why, when my friend Will suggested a weekend trip to Eagle's Hollow, a remote trail system deep in the Appalachians, I jumped at the chance. It was late October, the air crisp, and the leaves a fiery mosaic of reds and oranges. Will had heard about a secluded cabin a few miles off the main trail, a place where we could camp out for the night. It's abandoned, he said, but still in decent shape, a real hidden gem. The hike started out perfect. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the path. We joked and talked, the weight of our packs barely noticeable in the cool air. By late afternoon, we found the side trail that led to the cabin. It was narrow and overgrown, like no one had used it in years. After about an hour, the woods began to change. The trees grew closer together, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air felt heavier, colder. The cheerful chirping of birds disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Yeah," Will said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Finally, just as the last light of day began to fade, we saw it, a small, weathered cabin nestled in a clearing. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging slightly. A single window stared at us like a blind eye. "See?" Will said, grinning. "Told you it was here." The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with ash. A rickety table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a narrow staircase led to a loft above. "This is cozy," I said, trying to sound positive. We set up our sleeping bags on the floor and started a fire in the hearth. The warmth helped chase away some of the unease, and we spent the next couple of hours talking and laughing like we always did. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. Will said he was going to stay up a bit longer, staring into the fire. I climbed into my sleeping bag, letting the crackle of the flames lull me to sleep. I woke up to complete darkness. The fire had gone out, and the room was icy cold. I fumbled for my flashlight, my breath clouding in the frigid air. "Will?" I whispered. No response. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. Will's sleeping bag was empty. The chair by the fireplace was overturned. "Will?" I called again, louder this time. A faint sound came from outside, like footsteps crunching in the dead leaves. My heart began to race. I grabbed my jacket and the flashlight, shoving open the cabin door. The clearing was bathed in silver moonlight, the trees casting long skeletal shadows. I scanned the area, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Will! This isn't funny!" Another sound, this time behind me. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam landed on something carved into the cabin's wooden doorframe. A symbol. It looked ancient, a series of intersecting lines and circles. My stomach turned as I realized it hadn't been there before. "Will?" I called again, my voice cracking. A low whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it came from the woods. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, I stepped into the trees. The whispering grew louder, closer. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with every step. The air was so cold now that my fingers ached, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then I saw him. Will was standing about 20 feet ahead, his back to me. His head was tilted slightly, as though he were listening to something. "Will!" I yelled, relief flooding me. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't respond. I walked closer, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots impossibly loud in the silence. When I was just a few feet away, he turned to face me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw his face. It wasn't him. The eyes were all wrong. Too dark, too deep, as if they were holes that went on forever. his mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong on any human face. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hands. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the trees around me. That's when I saw them. Shapes, moving between the trunks. Tall and thin, their limbs impossibly long. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching me. I turned and ran, the cabin barely visible through the trees. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The whispering was louder now, coming from all around the cabin. And then, the door creaked. Not from the outside, from behind me. I don't normally drive at night, but last Friday I didn't have much of a choice. My brother called, saying my mom had been rushed to the hospital. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to make me drop everything, throw a bag in the car, and head toward the next town over. It was only an hour's drive, but most of it was through a stretch of winding back roads surrounded by dense forest. The first half of the trip was uneventful, just me and the hum of the car engine cutting through the stillness of the night. The further I got from town, the darker it became. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and my headlights barely seemed to dent the suffocating blackness pressing in from the trees. Around the halfway point, I noticed something strange. There was something in the road up ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was much smaller. A raccoon, maybe, but it wasn't moving. I slowed the car and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. It was a pile of sticks. I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy. Just some branches that had fallen onto the road, nothing unusual in the middle of nowhere. I drove around them and kept going, shaking off the odd sense of unease that had crept over me. A few minutes later, I saw it again. Another pile of sticks. This time, it was larger, spread out across the road like someone had arranged it deliberately. I slowed to a crawl, angling my headlights to get a better look. The sticks weren't just scattered randomly. They were laid out in a pattern, almost like a shape. A star? No. It was more intricate than that. I rolled down my window to get a better look, and immediately, I regretted it. The forest was silent. Completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Nothing. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made my skin crawl. I put the car in drive and sped up, leaving the strange formation behind me. About 5 minutes later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another pile of sticks. This one was enormous, stretching across the entire road. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet from the edge. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at it, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, debating whether I should get out and move the branches or turn around and take the long way to the hospital. That's when I saw it. Something moved at the edge of the trees. It was quick, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call my brother, but there was no signal. Of course, I muttered under my breath, trying to keep myself calm. I decided to move the sticks. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. Leaving the engine running, I stepped out of the car. The air was icy cold, and the silence was deafening. As I approached the pile, I realized it wasn't just sticks. There were bones mixed in. Small ones, like they'd come from rabbits or birds. But some of them were larger. I felt bile rise in my throat as I kicked at the edge of the pile, trying to clear a path. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. I froze, my eyes darting toward the sound. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. Something crouching low to the ground, just beyond the reach of my headlights. It wasn't an animal. Its limbs were too long, its movements too deliberate. It was watching me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I sprinted back to the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The growling grew louder, closer. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed up, turning sharply to avoid the pile of sticks. My headlights briefly illuminated the thing as I turned. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the light like an animal's. And its mouth was full of jagged teeth that didn't belong in anything human. I didn't stop driving until I reached the hospital parking lot. When I got out of the car, I noticed scratches on the rear bumper, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I told my brother about it, but he just laughed it off, saying I was probably tired and imagining things. Maybe he's right, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that growl in my head, and I'll never drive that road again. When I first moved to town, I didn't expect much. After my divorce, I wanted simplicity, a quiet place to rebuild my life. Wren Road seemed like the perfect spot. The house was old but charming, tucked at the end of a tree-lined street, far enough from the main road to feel secluded. The landlord called it quirky, which I assumed meant creaky floors and bad plumbing. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first week was uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, organizing, and trying to adjust to the silence. At night, the house groaned and sighed, but that felt normal for its age. By the end of the week, though, the quirks started to pile up. It began with small things. I'd close a door and return later to find it open. Lights I was sure I'd turned off would flicker back on. A picture frame on the mantel tilted itself overnight, though I was the only one there. I brushed it off as forgetfulness or drafty windows. Then, I started hearing the footsteps. At first they were faint, like something scurrying in the attic, soft taps just above my bedroom ceiling. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel. But as the nights passed, the sounds grew louder. It was no longer random scurrying, but deliberate, heavy footsteps moving from one end of the attic to the other. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of creaking floorboards in the hallway outside my room. My breath caught. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Summoning every ounce of courage, I whispered, "Who's there?" No response. I waited a minute, then another. Finally, I threw off the blankets and opened the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the nightlight I'd plugged in near the bathroom. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the space. Nothing. The next morning, I searched the attic. The ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The space was dusty and cramped, filled with cobwebs and forgotten junk. Old trunks, broken furniture, and boxes of yellowed newspapers lined the corners. At first, I saw nothing unusual. But as I moved the flashlight beam around, it landed on something small and shiny on the floor. A Polaroid photograph. I picked it up, brushing off the dust. The image showed a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing in what looked like my living room. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, her expression blank. I turned the photo over. Written on the back in shaky black ink was a single word: "Stay." My stomach dropped. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling the photo gave me. I called the landlord that afternoon, asking if the house had any unusual history. She hesitated before answering, her voice tight. "It's an old house," she said, carefully. "People come and go. Sometimes it can feel a little strange." That wasn't the answer I wanted. The next night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't confined to the attic. They moved through the house, down the hallway, into the living room. I sat frozen in bed, clutching my phone, too scared to investigate. At exactly 3:12 a.m., my bedroom door creaked open. I nearly screamed, but stopped myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. It swung open just a crack, enough for me to see the faint outline of the hallway. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. A shadow moved. I bolted upright and turned on the lamp. The light filled the room, but the doorway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I considered leaving for good. But something kept me there. Curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe something I didn't fully understand. I decided to dig deeper. At the local library, I found an article buried in the archives about a family who had lived in the house during the 1970s. The Harpers. They had a young daughter, Emily, who went missing one summer evening. No leads, no suspects, just gone. The family moved away a year later, unable to bear the memories. The librarian, an older woman with sharp eyes, noticed me reading the article. "You live there now?" she asked, lowering her voice. I nodded. "Be careful," she warned. "That house, it holds on to things." I wanted to ask what she meant, but her expression told me I didn't want to know. That night, I dreamed of Emily. She stood at the foot of my bed, her pale face illuminated by an unseen light. Her eyes were dark and sunken, her lips barely moving as she whispered something I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, her voice still echoing in my ears. By now, I was determined to leave. I packed a bag and decided to stay at a motel until I could sort things out with the landlord. But as I grabbed my keys, something caught my eye. On the coffee table was another Polaroid. This one was of me. The photo showed me standing in the kitchen looking out the window. I was wearing the same clothes I had on at that moment. My hands began to shake as I stared at it. Suddenly, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were running, fast and frantic. They came from the hallway, heading straight for me. I backed away, clutching the photo. "Who's there?" I shouted. The footsteps stopped. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The light above me flickered, then went out entirely. In the darkness, I heard a voice. "Stay." It was soft, childlike, but filled with an unshakable sense of menace. I didn't stay. I ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. At the motel, I called the landlord and told her I was breaking the lease. She didn't argue. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. Months later, I still can't explain what happened in that house. I've tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, or some elaborate prank. But late at night, when the world is quiet, I sometimes hear the faint echo of footsteps coming closer.